All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the September edition of our monthly Master Beef webinar series. We're excited to have you here. My name is Mallory. I'm one of the administrative coordinators for the series. If you haven't seen me already, tonight Dr. Mason is on the road, so she won't be with us. So it's just me and our speaker tonight. Tonight we have Mr. Kevin Ferguson here with us from the University of Tennessee Extension, going to talk with us. I see that our numbers are a little bit low, so I'm going to let Mr. Ferguson introduce himself while some more hop on, and we'll launch a poll question for you all to answer.
All right. Thanks, Mallory. And I need to go ahead and start sharing my screen now. Does that work? Okay.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
All right. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to share this information tonight. And I will say this is this topic that we've been sharing with our Master Farm Manager class for some time. And I will say myself and Dr. Charlie Martinez often team teach this. Dr. Martinez kind of covers the more so the management side of this farm transition, but this is a topic also when we talk about it that's getting a lot of attention across the state as well. We'll have one poll question, and we're always interested in how many people currently have a transition plan for their operation, But to get started, then why is there an interest in farm transition planning? Well, if you look at some information from the American Farmland Trust, and we're going to touch on several different reasons why there's interest now, but the American Farmland Trust says that the ownership of 40% of America's ag land will be in transition within the next 15 years. That means somebody different than current ownership will be making the management decisions on that. Well, also when we look at it, we know that there's a lot of loss of farmland, not only in Tennessee, but across the nation. And that's the one thing that American Farmland Trust looked at. And they presented some information back based in 2016. They identified what they termed the most nationally significant agricultural land. This is the most highly productive land in the nation. It's what we need to keep in production to be able to feed the nation and the world. And it was interesting to me that nearly 4.5 million acres in Tennessee was designated as nationally significant ag land. Well, then they looked at another designation that they called above or highly productive land, that they called it. And that's the area that you see with the green dots. That's all over the state of Tennessee. Well, they looked at the loss of farmland. And if you think back, this is from 2001 through 2016. And they projected that during that time period that Tennessee lost 277,000 acres of this highly productive land, of which 211,000 acres were that nationally significant acres. And if you'll notice, the areas in red is where that development is taking up farmland. And they also noted that it's a conversion of high development or high density commercial land and low development or land that's for subdivisions for houses. And I often ask people before we look at the next slide to think about how much do you think goes to commercial development versus development for houses. And remember, this information is from 2001 through 2016. And I often ask, at the rate we've been developing in the last 3, 4, 5 years, think about what this map would look like and how much more red would show up on it if it was updated through today. Well, what the American Farmland Trust did back on this study that ended in 2016, they said in total, we had lost nearly 660,000 acres of ag land during that time period. And the majority of it, close to 80%, is for houses. 22% is urban, highly developed. It may be also high density housing like apartments or something like that. But then they also look at the rate of farmland loss, and then are there any policies in place within the state to try to help slow down that loss and they came up with the most threatened states. And Tennessee was rated as the most, or the fourth highest threatened state in the US for the loss of farmland. Well, I think most of you realize that this has become kind of a hot topic issue. If any of you have been involved in the most recent Tennessee Farm Bureau Policy and Development conferences held across the state, addressing farmland loss was one of the topics that they came up with. Well, Farmland Trust took the information from 2001 through 2016, and they just recently, this has just came out within the last couple of months, updated it to what if that same rate of farmland loss continues through 2040. And if that rate happens or continued at that rate, it's projected that Tennessee would lose another 1 million acres of farmland. Another 1 million acres of farmland, or approximately 8% of the farmland that's out there now. I would encourage you that if you want to see this in more detail, look up the Farms Under Threat 2040 or the American Farmland Trust, and you can see some of these projections. Tennessee will pave over, fragment, or compromise over 1 million acres of farmland if development continues at the rate it is today. 52% of that conversion will occur on Tennessee's best land. And you think about it, you know, the best land that we have is often what's looked at as the best for development as well. And they talk about that's the equivalent of losing 8,700 farms, 14,000 jobs, and $258 million in farm output. What's unique about their interactive maps that they have now, and I haven't grabbed a screen capture of those, but it's neat to go on them. You can actually go in and look at individual counties within this data, and they note that Rutherford, Sevier, and Williamson County are the hardest hit in terms of losing farmland. So one of the reasons we're interested in farm transition plan, we know there's loss of farmland in the state. The other thing, average age of the principal owner, or average age of the farmer. And if we look at it based on Census of Ag data, and most of you know Census of Ag comes out every 5 years, 07, 12, 17, and guess what? This year, 2022, will be Census of Ag. You'll start getting that information probably near the end of the year, and sometime the first of next year, they'll ask to fill out that information. But if we look at it over time, the average age of the principal owner increases about a year every census cycle. Like in 2012, it was 58.3, the average age. 2017 is up to 59.4. It'll be interesting in this new census cycle if we get up to the average age is 60. But you can see with the trends that the numbers of farmers 75 and over, 65 through 74, continue to increase. What's interesting about it, not much change in the number of farmers under 35, but we're losing farms or farm ownership in the age group of 35 to 55. And another thing, if you kind of put the numbers together and think about it, for every principal operator or farmer under 25 years of age, there's 27 that are 75 years of age or older. So we've got loss of farmland in the state. The average farmer is getting older. So when you see this, you start having projections like some of them that we've already mentioned. Kachikova from University of Kentucky back in 2010 said over the next decade, half the farmers will retire and will be replaced by beginning farmers. I was working with Dr. Dave Cole up at Virginia Tech back in 2010 when he made this projection. He said 70% of the farm ground will change hands by 2025. Now, I know Dr. Cole really well, and I think he would say he was probably overly optimistic, just trying to spur some people's interest in farm transition planning. But the thing he would always mention, whether it's, and here's the Farmland Trust, 40% in the next 15 years, he would always note that somebody else is going to be making the management decision on that land. And that's what he was really trying to hammer home with that 70% of the farm ground. Well, what additional factors have influenced the rate of farmland change in ownership, management, or development? Well, this ought to sum it up pretty well. The annual value of farm real estate, and if you look over time, this is the percentage change. Ag farmland has been a relatively good investment. You know, we've got the Depression era back here in the late 20s and 30s. And then you went through a really good time period when we had the farmland values changing and being positive. And then we had the financial crisis of the 1980s. Matter of fact, that's the reason that I'm probably working today. The Manage program started in 1986, following the financial crisis, the devaluation of farmland. But for the most part, ever since then, we've seen tremendous changes, tremendous value added to farmland. And when you add in the additional value for the possibility of development, we know then that that farmland has been a really good investment over the time period. Well, I use this, and if you've seen some of my beef cattle presentations or others, you've probably seen this quote before. I firmly believe that adhering to tradition is the greatest obstacle to production agriculture. And there's a lot of truth about that, where we're talking about management of the cow herd, or we're talking about transition planning. I often ask, you know, why are you doing it now, or why are you doing it this way? And you'll often hear somebody say, well, we've always did it this way, or that's the way the grandparents did it, or that's the way dad did it, or mom did it. So, but when it comes to transition planning, you think a lot of times ag is a very proud industry. You hear people make references to the home place, or the 5th generation farm, a century farm, or 3 generations farming together. But no industry's got a stronger tradition of passing on the business, but we do a really poor job of accomplishing it and staying in the farming operation. So what do we look at? I've also used this for a number of presentations, and I won't go over all 11 of them, but top 11 pitfalls in farming. We could make a presentation for probably each one of these. First one, not knowing your cost of production. That's what the bankers and the economists will tell you. You know, if you don't know your cost of production, how are you going to know if you're going to make a profit? So if you're not making a profit, that's a pitfall in farming. But look at the second one. No plan for transferring the farm to the next generation. And there's several things that we'll talk about here that come up. Lack of communication. You know, avoiding or deferring taxes. We'll touch on family living expenses, not managing your family living expense. The very last one says not training the next generation. And I want you to think about that a little while, because oftentimes we ask, you know, or we're told, why do you like to farm, or why did you choose a farming lifestyle? And a lot of times people will say it's to raise their kids, their children in that environment. You've often heard probably the cliche, you know, what's the most important crop you'll ever raise, and that's your children. Well, often you hear people say they want to train their children and have a good, strong work ethic is the reason they like to farm. But I'll pose one more question to you. How often have you heard them say they want to train their children how to manage? And that's one thing that we miss when we talk about transitioning the management to the next generation. So, how about a definition? Farm succession planning. And notice it says it's a continuous process. And it involves transferring knowledge, skills, labor, management, control, and ownership between generations. And notice it doesn't mention a whole lot about assets. It's what people just usually think about is estate planning. But this talks about what knowledge has been transferred, what skills or labor or management or control has been transferred. So farm succession planning takes into account a lot of things. Excuse me. Farm succession planning includes that transition planning. It also includes estate planning. And a lot of times people just focus on estate planning and they think they have a transition plan. Tax implications can come into play. Business planning. How about retirement planning for the older generation, the parents? That's very important in succession planning. There may be a land use plan. Will the land be developed, or will the land go into a conservation easement? Okay. There may be then the information that a lot of times is not talked about. How do we transfer management? Is there everyone on board? Do we have the same family goals? What about labor and responsibilities? And then oftentimes, is there an exit strategy? What if something happens to one of the owners? How do we plan to exit this operation? Well, here's one of the conflicting things. We oftentimes have the situation when part of the family wants to continue the farm and the other part of the family or other heirs want to convert that land into cash and sale. Well, that's the difficult situation that always involves communication among the family. And go back to, again, Dr. Dave Cole. When he talks about what are goals and the fact that 80% of Americans have no goals. 16% have goals in their mind, but never write them down. 4% write them down and make 9 times more money. Now, I don't know if this is 100% true. I will tell you, when I was with Dr. Cole and he started covering this, I started writing down more goals. But I guess the whole thing is, does the entire family have the same goals? Do they have short-term and long-term goals that are same? What's the difference between family, lifestyle, business, and financial goals? And notice that everyone contributes. Everyone should contribute in the communication. And that's one of the difficult things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Why it's so difficult to start the conversation about farm transition planning. Well, why do farm families struggle to communicate? And this is some information that comes from Dave Marison up at Ohio State. I've had the opportunity to be on some programs with Dave, and he does an excellent job talking about family communications. He uses even some caricatures when he goes through the presentation. And when he ends the presentation, he points out that those are his father, his uncle, his aunt, because his father's family went through a very difficult transition plan. But the whole thing, we know that we've got to communicate, and there's a lot of things that cause problems in discussing this because, one, it's not an easy topic to discuss. We have off-farm heirs, on-farm heirs, there's generational differences, there's personality differences, there's gender differences. You know, how can we stop and improve this? Well, most of the time it starts with your own communication. You know, you need to learn about personality types and communication styles. Oftentimes, if you've got a family operation, you need to hold a family business meeting. Bring in some outside facilitators, possibly. And one of the best tasks that you can have if you've got multiple people involved in your operation is bring everyone in and have a name pulled out of the hat and say that person is no longer here. What information do they have about this family business that none of the rest of us know? And that's a very challenging thing to do, but it also lets you know what information regarding management or family business has not been transferred to the next generation. Well, in terms of succession planning, and this is why we asked that question earlier, most people do not do it. According to caring.com in their 2020 survey, only 68% of adults, or approximately 68% of adults in the US, do not even have a will. So we've only got approximately 30% of the adults in the US that even have a will. Well, and when we ask about having a transition plan, we've asked those folks that takes Master Farm Manager, and roughly only 16% have indicated in advance that they have some kind of farm transition plan. And I kind of bring this out to look at the 2017 Census of Ag and think about that. Only 16% have a transition plan. And I think our participants in Master Farm Manager are very reflective across the state of our ag industry. We've got large producers, we've got small producers, row crop, you name the livestock, it's very representative. And only 16% have any kind of indication of what they're going to do in transitioning that farm to the next generation. Well, look at the Census of Ag, 2017. $48.2 billion in land, buildings, machinery, and equipment in Tennessee. Now, we know today that would be much higher. It'll be interesting what that figure comes up to when we do the 2022 Census of Ag. But think about it this way. If that 16% is correct, only 16% roughly of the participants that own that $48 billion have a plan for how it's going to transition into the next generation, or how it's even going to transition. What other industry do you think would have that low of transition plans for their businesses that they would have? That's the reason we're trying to kind of share this information with more people, spur the interest, and say, you know, hopefully you would come up and help start discussions about a transition plan for your operation. Because whether you want to or not, one day your farm is going to experience a transition, whether you have a transition plan or not. And there's about 3 different ways that it can transition. As we saw earlier, about 30% of the people have a will. So that specifies how the ownership of assets will change. But if you have a transition plan, you got a viable business with a plan for continuation. And if neither one of those exists, and sometimes even with a will, the only option is a sale and division of assets. And we know what happens then. It's often an end to that operation. Well, what are some of the challenges that are out there? A major challenge is to determine where the business can afford the transition. You know, can we bring in the younger generation to help manage the operation at the same time? Is it profitable enough to do that? Often a bigger challenge is just determine how the family wants to handle the transition, you know, when the transition needs to occur. What about siblings that are involved that may not be involved in the farm? And we'll touch on that in just a little bit later. The greatest challenge is to go ahead and create and execute the plan, start the process. And, you know, what are the other challenges and opportunities? Typically, adequate retirement income for the parents should be the first priority. The parents' retirement income should be the first priority. And, you know, we often see things like cost of long-term care that really may totally deplete a lot of the assets if there hasn't been some plans to do that. So for retirement income, we need to figure out what were the lifestyles of those parents or the older generation. You know, what costs are going to be involved when they retire? You know, how much income maybe come from Social Security, savings, investments from the farm? Oh, and we need to adjust that for inflation if we're going to plan over very many years. Speaking of inflation, where are we now? Here's 100+ years of inflation. The annual percentage change in the CPI, which is our inflation rate. And notice I've got the information over here. In 2021, it was reported at 7%. We peaked in June of this year at 9.1%. It's come off of that just a little bit now. 9.1 may be the high, hopefully, but we've had their energy costs come down. But look how far back you had to go before we've experienced inflation at this rate. Basically back to 1980 and 81. Look at here, look at the 10-year average and the 20-year average prior to 2021 and see what the inflation rates were. We've been averaging about 2% a year for 20 years. So in addition to this, what's also associated with it, you've seen what they're trying to do from the Fed now to combat high inflation rate, raise interest rates. So if we raise interest rates and, you know, probably we keep hearing there's at least another raise that's in the works from the Fed. But as I mentioned earlier, I started to work back in 1986. The higher interest rates hang on for a while. And the whole thing during this time period of low inflation, we've also had relatively low interest rates. We've got an entire generation of farmers, lenders, supply salesmen that have never experienced double-digit interest rates that we did back here in the mid-80s. And when I say double digits, I'm not just meaning 10% or 11%. We saw interest rates as high as 21, 22, 23% back here during this time. So we're definitely in kind of challenging times now from a finance standpoint in the current inflation rate. Well, what we want to look at if you're going to try to bring in an existing younger generation into a current operation is the farm profitable? Can we support multiple generations? Sometimes we may need to look at what's the desired family living that somebody has. You know, and we don't collect any family living data in Tennessee. There is some available to us from the University of Kentucky. Illinois collects some really good family living expense information, and this is what I put up. They'll have an update to this in October of this year. But the thing that I want to show about family living expenses, and I flipped their figures here. We've got figure 2 first, and it shows net farm income and then non-farm income. Net farm income's in the purple, non-farm income down here in kind of the reddish purple. And notice it stays relatively flat, increases some over the time period 21 through 2020. But look how volatile net farm income has been. You know, 2011, 2012, when we had the historical returns, and this would be mainly row crop farmers up there in Illinois. Then we saw the big drop, been volatile ever since. But what about family living expenses? They rarely go down. They rarely go down. They increase when we get more income from the net farm side, but then they rarely decrease. So that makes it very difficult from the standpoint of adjusting, especially during times of high inflation. And if you look at this and add it all together, some people will say there's no way you spend that much on family living, but this is over 1,000 farm families, and the expense is an average of over $100,000 spent on family living when we include taxes, capital expenses, and non-capital expenses. So, you know, Will the farm support a transition? Family living, $100,000 plus or minus a lot. My good friend Steve Isaacs and I have looked at the Kentucky data, and what we'll see is that family living expenses is not on a nice bell-shaped curve. What you tend to have is the folks that will spend a group that spend more on family living, and then the ones that are more frugal, more conservative, and spend less on family living. But then going back again to Dave Cole, notice this next thing when we talk about the older generation. Couples over the age of 65 require 25% more in family living expenses to support lifestyle compared to a 35-year-old couple. And I will be honest, I asked Dr. Cole, I said, you got to explain this to me. And he said, and I will point out here, this is prior COVID, of course, but he said, okay, all those couples, 65 years of age and over, or they're going to spend a lot of money on medical expenses compared to the 35-year-old couple. They travel a lot more, and especially they're going to spend money on their grandchildren. It all made sense from that standpoint. But so how does this transition affect retirement planning for that older generation? And I put in a little math here just to show you why it's important, not only from long-term health, but just if you've got the older generation that's wanting to ease out of the operation, but they're still going to have to, what do? They have to eat. You can look at this and know I'm talking about for something 365 days, so it's a yearly deal. You've got parents, 3 meals a day, $5 per person per meal. So $10 per meal for the parents. 365 days a year times 15 years, it's going to take $164,000. If we splurge, and it's going to be on average $15 per meal for the parents for each meal, that's $250,000 that we need or need to be in reserve, or they're going to have the income from just for food and maintenance during that time. And we hadn't adjusted for inflation. So that's got to be in the planning process too. Okay, now you get down to some of the difficult things to discuss. Where do we start? Well, it's often very awkward for the kids to initiate the conversation about we need to look at a transition plan. And this is one of the challenges that's out there. I've heard this from some of the younger generation farms. I've heard them say that possibly the father was totally against starting this conversation, but somehow or another, we need to convince the parents. And it may be someone outside of the family that convinces the parents that we need to initiate this conversation. And there was a discussion I mentioned earlier at the Farm Bureau Policy and Development meeting, the one I attended not long ago, that, you know, maybe we need to start and focus this on the younger farmers as well, the ones that are in the 35 to 40 to 50 age range, instead of waiting till you think about it when we get older in the 60s or 70s. I will say I made this presentation or a similar presentation a few years ago up in Kentucky at a young dairyman's conference, and there was a kind of a unique deal. They were first generation dairy producers there. Young couple, had 2 young children, and I'm guessing that the attendants when they were there, those kids were probably both preteen. Went through this presentation. At the break, they came up and said, we really appreciate you presenting this. Said, what we've decided already is we want to discuss this as our children grow up so that they know what their options are. And I thought that's a good way to approach it, to start at such an early age, or what would be an early age, and gauge their interest. Do they want to stay on the farm? Do they want to transition? But lender or the financial advisor may be a catalyst. That's a good place for someone to spur the older generation on and say, hey, you probably need to think about this. Parents, it's just not slowing down. They could still be involved in the operation. And notice, very important, we'll go into this in just a little more detail, a transition team can be very important to this. And this is the reason so many people don't want to approach it. or they don't want to go and do the entire plan. And it's not just a one and done. You need to update it periodically because things will change. So what about that transition team? So if you're going to develop that plan, you need to seek advice from several different sources. And I'll tell you that I've heard producers say they got their best advice from an attorney. Others will say it came from their accountant. But here's some of the things that you need to reach out to. And you need to reach out to these people and possibly get more information. The attorney, an accountant, a financial planner, one of those may be very tuned into the tax issues, your lender, the extension educator, a business consultant, and one of them may be the one that's the facilitator that really tries to encourage the communication. So they really function as an advisory board. You know, you just can't do a complete transition plan by just talking to the attorney or just talking to an accountant. Everything needs to come together. A lot of people will hire a facilitator. And this is a very important point. When we talk about this is a difficult and awkward thing to discuss sometimes among the family, you need to get off site. This is not a kitchen table discussion because it's difficult for farms to separate. You know, when you think about the kitchen table, growing up on the farm, the discussions were you can't leave the business aside and just talk about family because it's all tied together right there. You know, it's all tied together. You've gone through the good times and the bad times, discussing everything at that kitchen table. So it's easier to get off site. And oftentimes we talk about learning during our educational process and training, but I always mention that a lot of times I've learned more from the farmers that I worked with. A few years ago was going through and working with a couple of brothers that the older generation had passed away. You had one brother that was planning to continue on the farm. The other brother lived about an hour and a half away and it wasn't interested in the farm at all. And they were trying to discuss how all this was going to work out in the transition plan. And this was after the parents had passed away. So there wasn't a plan in place. And I asked the brother that was there on the farm, I said, well, how do you all discuss this? How do you communicate? And he said, well, when my brother comes for us to start this discussion, he said, we go down to the church that we grew up in. He said, we tend to keep our emotions better in check, sitting there at the church to discuss what we're going to do in this transition. And, you know, it dawned on me, they're doing an excellent thing there. They'll probably work through this because, one, they got off site. They knew that if they were sitting at the church they grew up in or near that facility, that they would keep their emotions in check and have a productive discussion. I've also heard some, and Dr. Dave Cole actually said that facilitator is probably not doing their job unless they make you mad a couple of times in this discussion as well. So what's some of the other things? This is the reason I think that you should figure out pretty quickly that you need a team. And I've kind of borrowed this from Alan Galloway makes a presentation in their farm transition planning and farmland legacy about estate planning tools. And Alan started with me as a area farm management specialist back in '86. But these are just some of, if not, hopefully I've captured most of them, the tools that can be used in estate planning and transition planning. We mentioned a will, power of attorney, you know, that durable power of attorney for finance, advanced care directives that we mentioned earlier, medical directives, leaving wills, trust, and there's all types of trusts that can be discussed. Ownership. There's all types of ownerships that can be discussed, whether it's LLCs. And you don't have to have an LLC just because it's a business, but there's ways that LLCs can possibly use to aid in transitioning. You know, we've got IRAs, 401ks, insurance. And I've often been told by attorneys that a lot of times insurance, a good insurance policy may take the place of what could have been formed with an LLC. Letter of last instructions, and I'll show you a really neat handout or PDF file that we have for that. Kind of a hot topic issue is conservation easements. I will say you'll have people that are very positive about conservation easements as a way to transition that farm. Of course, most of you know that if there is a conservation easement, what will it do? It lowers the market value, of course, for that land. And I will say that I visited farms not long ago. In the same week, one family had a conservation easement in place. They were very happy with it. It met what they wanted to do from a goal standpoint. I went to another farm that week, talked about the same thing with transition plan with another older generation with, I think it was 3 children, and conservation easement was not in his goal or in his plan because he said he didn't want to limit the future generation. So that's some of the positive and negatives you'll hear. Charitable donations, disability, long-term care insurance. Even if we're doing planning, burial and prepayment or burial insurance can come into estate planning tools. So what do? Involve and prepare the family. And this is sometimes where I step on a few toes if we're talking about multiple generations. Working here does not necessarily qualify you to be the manager. I was on a webinar not long ago with a lot of bankers, and one of them mentioned in this, it was a lot of times recommended that the younger generation go off, work for somebody else before they come back to the operation. And another pointed out, well, sometimes they need to go off, work for somebody else, and get promoted before they come back to the family operation. And so there's a lot of things from that standpoint to think about. You know, working here does not necessarily qualify you to be the manager. And then the one thing we often hear, don't protect the next generation from the current business problems or successes. Whether that we're facing financial difficulties or we're in strong financial situation, has the next generation seen the books? And I'll be quite honest with you, over my 30 plus years working with Extension, I've gone in where there'd be multiple generations working together. I've talked to the sons, for example, and daughters that were in their 50s, and they had never seen the books for the operation. Or the only time that they saw the books is when there was some serious financial problems. So don't keep the younger generation from seeing the books. And I'll share another Dr. Dave Cole story. This is something in our workshops that I've been with him on that we always mention about the next generation seeing the books. And he called me up, and he was out in the Midwest, and he said, Kev, I've got one that's got you beat. And I said, well, Dr. Cole, you've always got me beat. And he said, well, I made her comment about has the next generation seen the books? And he said, after the meeting, there was a gentleman walked up to me and he said, so you think I need to show the boys the books? And he said, I looked down, and this gentleman, I asked him how old he was, and he was in his early 90s. And his boys were in their late 60s and early 70s, and they had never seen the books on this very successful row crop operation. The boys had raised their families, they had a home, they had been paid as they worked on the farm, but the boys had never seen the books. The gentleman was in his 90s. The next one's very difficult. Treat siblings, heirs, fairly, not necessarily equally. Equal may not be possible or desirable. We often hear somebody talk about dividing a 300-acre farm among 3 children, let's say, 3 heirs, 100 acres, 100 acres, and 100 acres. Is that equal? Well, it probably is not when we look at road frontage, quality of the land, anything like that. And there's always the discussion, what about the heir or the child that stayed on the farm while other children were not involved in the farm? And now we're trying to figure out, you know, how do we share this, the assets for the farm? And I will say, there is formulas out there. I guess the first thing that I often ask for the person that's working on the farm, how were they compensated while they were working? Were they just paid as a regular hired hand while they were there? Did they receive management compensation? And I know of some farms that where that situation is happening, where possibly, let's say you've got 3 siblings and you've got one brother that's staying on the family farm, maybe it's incorporated, and that brother draws not only a labor salary, but a management salary. But there are some formulas out there that says if a individual stays on that farm and has helped build that farm net worth over the years, then they should be given a little higher share, possibly 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 share compared to individuals that haven't been on the farm. As somebody says, they put in sweat equity into the operation. There's always exceptions to the rule, but that's just one thing that's out there. And I put in, don't neglect the spouses, may not be a priority for some. That's where you've got to get everybody in the communication. This is where Charlie comes in. Keys to success is management. And Charlie's got a lot more information, Dr. Charlie Martinez, that he shares about this. But point out that transferring ownership is easier than transferring management and leadership. And that's how we mentioned earlier that a lot of times we need to come in and look at what management or what knowledge regarding management has not been transferred to the next generation. And note here, I said most parents don't believe this, but management and leadership often have a low heritability coefficient. Yeah, I'll throw in some beef cattle genetics there. Low heritability coefficient. Leaders and managers are trained, not born. So that's why I asked, instead of just hearing parents say when they're out there working on the farm, wanted to teach our children a strong work ethic, I would then pose the question is, how about teaching them to manage and lead during that time as well? Notice that new management team requires input from both generations, and managing is a continual education process. That's the reason if you can start those children learn earlier. One of the things we see right now is the younger generation that are so in tune to technology and computers about keeping records or anything like that. It's a great place to get them started in terms of knowing the management and the operation of a farm. Well, why do transitions fail? And there's a number of these. Most of them are obvious to you all. You know, mixing business and family is a difficult thing when we talk about farming operations. Strengths don't often align with the business needs. That's something that we often see. Sometimes I've worked with, for example, maybe you've got 2 siblings that inherit the operation. One of them is really strong on the business side. One's really strong on the production side. The business person decides to leave and go pursue other opportunities. Then it comes a very big challenge for that person that has just been really strong in production to manage the business side of the operation. And you know, I'll throw this out. I mentioned Dr. Steve Isaacs. He and I wrote a little news article not long ago about being an opportunity or an obligation. And you think about the difference. If you've got someone that works in town, and let's say they're in marketing and they decide they want to go back to school and they're going to be an attorney, what do we say about them? Well, they changed careers. But what do we say about that young person that grew up on the farm and they've worked on the farm for maybe some time, but they decide they don't want to be a farmer? They want to go and pursue another career, but oftentimes, how are they looked on in the farming community? It's like they failed their obligation. They failed in being a farmer. So it's very difficult at times, and that's where we talk about communication is very important. Then there's often those unexpected events, an untimely death, marriage, divorce, weather, the economy. They can come in and change a transition plan. Lack of parental approval and affirmation. It takes the parents. I will share, just recently, I got an email after a Master Farm Manager class that they indicated that the father had passed away, and he was the one that was always opposed to discussing any kind of future plan for the farm, for the estate, for transition. And that now that he had passed away, the mother was really wanting to pursue it. She wanted to talk to an attorney to actually get the information in and start the discussion, because the father had been totally opposed to it, because it is such a difficult situation to discuss. Yeah, and we know there's sibling disputes that can cause it. And it all goes back to that failure to communicate. I will share with you that there's a number of resources that are out there to assist with this. Oftentimes we put on a farmland legacy workshop. This is something that started 10, 12 years ago. And about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we went back and revisited this. We redone, updated the manual that we call it, the Planning Today for Tomorrow's Farms. This is available for free. You can go online and search for Farmland Legacy, and you should come up. You've got PDF files of each one of the chapters that are in this. It includes the estate planning tools, talks about how to work with a professional and how to find a professional. Lots of information that's there and available. We do a lot of work with the University of Minnesota. That's where we get a lot of our software from that we work with. And they have something called Ag Transitions. It's like an online app. You have to give them an email to be able to log into it, but it will lead you through developing a transition plan. Also, there's lots of other information out there. Iowa State University has a lot of information on their Beginning Farming Center, the farmland information that I mentioned earlier. One last thing that we have, and typically in our programs, we will email this, what my family should know. And I will say that you can look for someone, Ann McKinney. Ann McKinney is an attorney from East Tennessee that we have utilized on some of our programs. And that's not an endorsement. That's just, she has been on a number of the programs that we have had in East Tennessee. You can find those attorneys across the state that specialize in estate planning. But she has this booklet, or her firm has this booklet called What My Family Should Know. And it used to be just a straight booklet, but they have actually created this into a PDF file. It's an online, or it's a fillable PDF file. You can download it, put the information in. I can email it to you directly if you want it emailed to you, or you can search for What My Family Should Know, McKinney, and you should be able to find it. But this is something that you can at least put all the information that you have. And I will tell you, it's very important that you do this and someone knows. I speak from experience. My wife is just recently, she's involved now being the executrix for her uncle's estate. Her uncle was 80 years old, no children, died unexpectedly, and there was no information, no information. But all of this can be filled in, talking about everything about the last will and testament, where there's trust documents, information regarding a living will, instructions for the funeral, anything regarding banking records that can be added into this. It can be updated. It's a great place to start if you don't know anything about those preferences for an older generation or the older family members. I do note that it contains sensitive data, or it's optional. It asks for, bank account numbers. Those can be entered. They don't have to be entered, but if they are entered, remember that's sensitive data and you need to make sure you secure that. But this is a great place to start in discussing, and it's a kind of a way to get that discussion started. It's a means that if it hasn't been discussed in the past, you can use a document like this as kind of a jump start to get the communication started about a transition plan. And I'll close out. Looks like we're going right at nearly an hour with just some friendly reminders. Don't assume you'll have time or feel well enough to complete your bucket list. If you've got a bucket list, if it's something you want to check off, make sure you go ahead and do it, because who knows if we'll have the time or feel well enough to do it later on. The other thing I'll ask is, if you're in a farming operation, or if you're in a business, a family-owned business, what knowledge has not been transferred? What do you know about that operation that no one else knows that may need to know it if something arises and you're not there? Don't leave the burden of making decisions to the surviving spouse or the next generation. I mean, there's multiple ways to communicate that information. We've talked about communication, and it all centers around that. Be open about your wishes and the goals. Make sure you talk to your kids, your spouse, your parents, and your grandparents. And, maybe only 16% of the folks that we work with have plans for their transition, but there's no time like today to start. You can go ahead, get started, and hopefully be successful in planning for the future. And like I said, this is not a presentation to let you know how to do everything. It's far from that. It's just hopefully a presentation to pique your interest and say, hey, we need to do that. My email's up there, my contact information at the office. If you want to contact me directly and I can pass on some of that information, that'd be great. Otherwise, Mallory, I'll stop sharing. Kick it back to you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for speaking tonight. We certainly appreciate it. Everyone attending, I'm about to launch a poll. It wouldn't be a monthly Master Beef meeting without one small technical difficulty. So if everyone, while we're thinking of any questions we might want to ask Mr. Ferguson while we still have him available tonight, if you'll answer that poll for me, we'd certainly appreciate it. And always remember, you can use the chat box or the Q&A box to answer or to ask any questions. We'll get those answered for you, certainly. All right, looks like we're up to almost 80% participation on our poll. That's awesome. I'll leave that open for a few more seconds if everybody will get their answers in, and any questions you might have be typed. I'll certainly leave a couple of minutes to get those in. Sounds good, Mr. Upchurch. Thank you.
That's about right, Greg. I mean, that's actually kind of high, but 5 of 20, and that's very, that's very reflective of what we see. Very reflective of what we see. I will share also that there's been quite a bit of discussion, and we've actually have some follow-ups and I think this is something, the loss of farmland in the state is going to have some attention. We've been in some meetings already with Farm Bureau representatives and the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. I will share that it's on their radar, and they want to look at some different things and how things are being done in other states. So I think you'll see that more often coming up.
All right, we had 95% participation on our poll, so we certainly appreciate that. We'll get that information to Mr. Ferguson. Again, if anybody has any questions while we've got him on our webinar tonight, please feel free to type those up or send them in the chat. You all have his email, and I can send his email as well if you think of any past the webinar tonight too.
Now that looked good. If we were up close to 30%, it's higher than normal. That's good. And you know, it's the whole thing. Some people will say, and even if you don't have all of the pieces in place, you know, make sure that you know it's beyond just an estate plan or a tax plan. Talk about the transition into the next generation is really important as well. So, okay.
All right. Don't mean to rush, but if nobody has any questions, we'll end tonight. We certainly appreciate you for tuning in tonight for the September monthly Master Beef meeting. Next month, the October meeting will be our last meeting, so we're saving some good stuff for last. Courtney Bridges will be joining us to talk about some advancements in reproductive technology, so it'll be certainly a good one to tune into. But if anybody has any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me or Dr. Mason. If anybody has any questions for Mr. Ferguson, I can get that contact information for you as well. But with all that being said, we hope you have a good night. Thank you, Mr. Ferguson.
Thanks. See ya.